Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar on weight loss jabs. Could they help or hinder sustainable dietary shift? I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker today, Victoria Stevens from Bramble Partners, who will guide us through this topic and who I will introduce more shortly in a second. I'm Jess Frenberg. I'll be your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change at the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. Also with me is my colleague, Professor Neil Ward, who's a co-lead of AFN, also based at UBA, and Neil will step in if my internet goes wrong or anything like that. If you don't know us already, AFN is a UKRI-funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. So we're focused on net zero. We've got almost 3,000 members now across the UK, so we've got an excellent kind of collective pool of knowledge. So if you haven't joined us already, please do so. I think Neil is going to share some links in the chat shortly, which should take you through to the website. So today's topic, there's been obviously a lot of discussion, headlines, column inches dedicated to weight loss jabs like Ozempic, Mounjaro, Wegovy, and others the last couple of years. Early evidence is showing promising results to suppress appetite and tackle obesity, which we know costs the UK billions of pounds a year. The rollout of jabs could become pretty widespread across the population. So we're talking about potentially, huge implications for how and what people eat, as well as a lot of profits to be made in this area. There are, of course, lots of questions, surrounding all of this, but a big one that needs looking at and that hasn't perhaps been so talked about, which we're addressing today, is what do these jabs mean for the UK agri-food system more widely, and our ability to shift diets towards those that are more healthy, nutritious, and critically sustainable as well. So what could their impact be on food system emissions? What could these weight loss jabs mean for influencing demand, product development, what we produce in response, farming systems, and landscape scale shifts? So our speaker, Victoria, is a partner at Bramble Partners and has spent time looking into all of this. Victoria is a strategy advisor, formerly a partner at Bain & Co in the consumer products and sustainability practices. She has deep experience working with food and health focus on FMCGs, retailers and brands on their strategic choices, the operational enablers and insight needed to drive action. So Victoria, if you'd like to get your slides ready. So what will happen is Victoria will present for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have audience Q&A for hopefully around at least 30 minutes. If you've got questions as Victoria is presenting, please put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat so that I can find them easily afterwards. Please feel free to use the chat for discussion, sharing links, anything like that. But if you can remember to put your your questions in the Q&A box, that will really help. So Victoria, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me share those. Okay, so as Jez mentioned, we're here to talk about the appetite suppressant drugs. You'll hear them termed GLP-1s. You might hear the names Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. So we'll talk about those through these materials. To share a couple of the key messages. So, as many on this call know, we are facing an obesity and diet-related disease crisis, fueled by our, what we term the junk food cycle, a term you might have heard from the National Food Strategy. The appetite suppressant drugs are one tool to treat obesity. They have been shown to be highly successful in managing weight, sort of up to a 20 or 25% weight loss while taking the medication. Uptake is growing rapidly. So recent data suggests that in excess of 1.5 million UK patients, about 4% of adults, and many people are choosing to access these privately, given the NHS access is more restrictive, and we'll get into some of the details around that. When people are taking this medication, they do materially shift their food consumption. So they reduce the calories they eat by about 500 calories a day, and they shift the mix of what they eat. We think the disruption could be very meaningful in terms of how much we eat, both individually and at a population level, the relevance of different foods and the occasions that people eat at, and the role of nutrient-dense food being increasingly important if people are eating a smaller amount of food. The opportunities are also very widespread, from different foods that people eat or products, from the services that support how they choose to eat and what they choose to eat, to the infrastructure of our entire food systems, from the data that forecasts things to the logistics that gets food from the farm to individuals. Coming to the impact on climate, nature, and environment, we do think that to have a meaningful change here would require widespread and sustained use of these drugs. We're quite a long way away from that right now, but it is a really interesting one to consider what that could look like. And it could reshape our demand for food, reshape our use of land, and rebalance it, what is grown and where. So one of the questions I wanted to explore a little bit today was, what would it take for these drugs to be considered a firebreak in reshaping our food system rather than themselves the solution, which is often how they might be discussed. I won't dwell on the data around obesity because I think everybody on this call is well aware of that. You might be familiar with the term the junk food cycle from the National Food Strategy. This diagram lays out how the obesogenic environment is fueled by the food that we eat, both the sort of commercial intent as well as our biological desire for calorie-rich and tasty food. So how do the appetite suppressant drugs work? These drugs are synthetic compounds which mimic naturally occurring hormones. The body has receptors for these hormones, and that triggers a series of biological responses. That leads to a patient feeling fuller and more satiated, to slowing their digestive system, and to stimulating a blood sugar response to stabilize their blood sugar. These drugs have been in use for a number of years, initially to treat type 2 diabetes, and then more recently for weight management, typically at a higher dose than under diabetes treatment. There are over 100 more drugs in clinical trials and development, and many are exploring a wider set of clinical indications, using the GLP-1 receptors in the body in many different tissues in the body. So trials are underway to explore how these drugs may be beneficial from everything from neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, cancers, cardiovascular diseases, and many more. You may also have heard that there's research underway exploring how they treat things like addictive disorders. So there's a wide potential for how these drugs could be used more broadly than just weight management. So there's a significant amount of scientific research underway, but there's also a lot more that needs to be known. When individuals take these drugs, it does substantially change their food consumption. So it changes how many calories or how much food is consumed, how frequently they eat, and the types of food that they eat. And on the right-hand side, you'll see just a selection of data around how people's spend has changed when they're taking these drugs. So we can see that they significantly reduce spend in categories such as snacks, more indulgent foods. Typically, a lot of this is discretionary foods. People reduce how much they drink in terms of soft drinks as well as alcohol. And there is also a slight increase in what people eat in terms of fresh produce and categories such as dairy, which are high protein and easily digestible. Numerous studies have suggested that people reduce their calorie consumption by about 25 to 30%. There's obviously a bit of variability in that between individuals, which equates to about 500 calories a day. And they typically see the weight loss reduction of up to 20% in the newest drugs over a 6 to 12 month period. As people reduce their calorie consumption by sort of 25 to 30%, one of the key considerations is ensuring that patients get a sufficiently nutrient-dense selection of food in what they are eating to fulfill their micro and macronutrient needs. So these appetite suppressant drugs can really disrupt the demand engine of this junk food cycle. We talk about this as a potential to be a fire break. So they really change how much food people need and demand. This breaks different feedback loops that reinforces our desire for calorie-dense food and reduces an individual's response to some of the commercially motivated drivers, so different eating occasions, different snacking, and the way that people have been, some people have been consuming food in excess. Looking at what the availability of these drugs is in the UK, so about 15 to 20 million adults in the UK are clinically eligible under the MHRA guidelines. And that is typically for patients who have a BMI over 30, or in some instances, a BMI of 27 with other weight-related health conditions, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, etc. The NHS guidelines are more restrictive. Partly this is, a slow rollout to ensure that it is done with good knowledge of what really helps people. But it's also, a costly drug, and so it is not something NHS are rolling out at a widespread basis right now. Those NHS access guidelines are changing and evolving. So that is an area that we'll continue to watch over the coming years and how that might shift. So NHS spending on these drugs has increased significantly in the past 12 months as the rollout has started more broadly. Until recently, you've needed to access these drugs through weight management clinics, which provide a comprehensive set of wraparound services, nutrition support, behavior, lifestyle support, among others. In large part, why these drugs are expensive for the NHS is those additional services that are provided alongside purely the cost of the drugs. That is designed to ensure people can fully make the most of what these drugs offer in terms of changing their diet and lifestyle patterns and ensuring sustained but healthy weight loss. Because the NHS guidelines are more restrictive than the MHRA guidelines, there has been significant interest in the private sector for these drugs. And you'll have, I'm sure, seen lots about this in the press. So we believe about 1.5 million people are accessing these drugs, and they're about anywhere between 120 and 300 pounds per month for a private prescription. Usage has similarly doubled in the last year. And many people are accessing these through online pharmacies. There are good reasons why people are accessing these drugs privately. The NHS access is restrictive and can be more easy to access these online for an individual. One of the more interesting elements of these drugs is that people are choosing to pay for them privately. Which is not something we would typically see, from many other drugs, and that's in part because of people's awareness around the health, their health conditions if they're living with obesity. But there's also, a vanity aspect. It's something that's a very visible complaint, and people might choose to take proactive action. There's also very, very high awareness of these drugs. They obviously cannot be advertised, but they are widely covered in the mainstream press on an almost daily basis at the moment. One of the challenges of these drugs is that if people discontinue the treatment, they do put the weight back on within sort of 12 to 24 months, or they put the majority of their weight back on. There are a number of different studies that show a similar trend. There's one shown here on the right, on the left-hand side, which shows how once people, they lose weight rapidly when they're taking the drug, but when they stop taking the drug and return, to not taking it, their weight does regain, and that's a biological response. to no longer having those hormonal receptors met with the drugs. Lifestyle and behavioral changes can effectively contribute to minimizing weight regain. So, many patients do keep some of the weight off that they have lost while taking the drugs, but it's an area where much more research and evidence needs to be developed to identify what are the most effective ways to help people keep the weight that they have lost off if they choose to discontinue the drugs. When we think about what the potential of these drugs could be, it could be transformational. So there are many forecasts, and there is we do not have a crystal ball in terms of what will happen. But if we take a scenario that is perhaps bolder in terms of what it could look like, we're at about 1.5 million prescriptions today, which took about 15 years for drugs such as statins or SSRIs to reach. If we think about what this could look like over the next 10 years or so, we know the price of these drugs will drop significantly. Some estimates are up to about 80%, as there's greater supply of the drugs, patents expire, and interestingly, the format changes from an injection format at the moment to a pill format. And dosage levels, side effects, and some of the reasons that people discontinue the drugs are improved in such a way that people maintain their treatment for longer. Coming on to what this could mean from an upstream perspective or a whole food system perspective. If we go back to thinking about some of the core behavior shifts, the reduction in calories in food consumed, the reduction in the frequency of food that people consume, and the shift in terms of what people eat, there are some interesting implications from a climate net zero nature perspective. I do think that to really see these impacts, we would need to see substantial and sustained levels of GLP-1 use across the population for it to really have an impact in terms of moving what food we eat at an entire population level rather than an individual level. So the reduction of food could mean, we need to change what food is grown. And these might be particularly relevant in some of the commodity crop areas of starches, oils, sugars, particularly as you think about people eating less snacks, less starchy foods, less rich, indulgent, desserts, cookies, sweet treats, etc. Reduction in food could mean less pressure on agricultural land, with the potential to either shift land use and or reduce the intensity of agricultural production without increasing prices. And then we'd see a further impact due to reduced food demand through the full value chain. If we think about the shift in the mix of what people eat, the real question here is around the carbon intensity of the food consumed. You may have had a lot of discussion around protein and the need for protein to be consumed while people are taking these drugs. There's not good evidence yet that suggests people are increasing the absolute amount of protein that they eat, but it is certainly a more important relative part of their diet as they stop consuming other foods. And the message does reach individuals that they need to maintain their protein consumption. We do see some evidence that people are increasing the consumption of dairy, for example, but it's an area that we're continuing to watch. We do also see some slight evidence that people are increasing the amount of fruit and vegetables they eat, for example, which could be interesting from this perspective. As people are eating potentially more perishable food, the waste and circularity of these foods and how that's managed will need to be an important consideration because these are people are eating much less of the very shelf-stable, highly packaged foods and these foods which have a shorter shelf life. One of the elements which is we discussed earlier is around the nutrient density of the food that people eat. And I think that's a particularly interesting one from an agricultural perspective. How do we ensure that the food that people are eating is as nutrient dense as possible? to ensure that they have all of the micro and macronutrients while they are taking these drugs that enable them to live, maximize their health. So one of the questions that we're exploring is how do these drugs act as a fire break and accelerate the food system shifts that we would want to see? So I think there's a couple of areas to consider. Firstly, I think it's recognizing that these drugs are here, and unless there are substantial further, the substantial side effects discovered that slow down the rollout of this, we need to ensure that there is affordable, equitable access to these drugs for anybody who is clinically eligible. We haven't discussed side effects, but because these drugs have been in use for diabetes patients for a number of years, the scientific community are relatively confident there are not substantial, widespread long-term side effects, but there is further research going on in this as reports emerge. There is research going into pancreatic conditions, for example. So it's a space to continue watching, but there is relatively good confidence that there are no significant unintended side effects. We need to see good wraparound services which support sustained behavior and lifestyle shifts for individuals who are taking these drugs so they can get the right foods to live a healthy life. We need to increase our focus on nutrient-dense foods which nourish people and value that through the whole supply chain from farm to fork. We'd want to maximize the potential impact of reduced demand on agricultural intensity and land use, and do that in a thoughtful, intentional way. But as that land use might change or different crop requirements might change, we'd need to proactively manage the price impact of reduced demand from a farmer perspective. And then, as I touched on previously, there's a big consideration to be made as perishable foods are increasingly relevant, how we would reduce waste and increase circularity of those foods to reduce overall emissions. So Jez, I'll stop there in terms of presentation and turn over to questions and discussion.
Right, thanks so much, Victoria. There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? I mean, I guess what you've just ended on in terms of whether this is a fire break or seen as a panacea, are you getting any sense from the NHS or Department for Health which one of those it's kind of edging towards? Because it's sort of slightly concerning if it's going to be seen more as a panacea, if, like you're saying, if people discontinue it, they put the weight back on and it's extremely expensive and all of these other things.
So I think at the moment, from a health department perspective, it's probably more erring towards a bit of a panacea, given where the health system is, and given the overall cost of treating obesity and associated diseases. The recent government announcements around health have suggested there will be more active rollout of these drugs. It does remain very cautious under the NHS. So it is, it is still only available to a relatively small proportion of people within the NHS, but that could change over the next year. So I think from a kind of health policy perspective at the moment, the focus is on let's treat the outcome and typically use drugs to do that rather than think holistically. I would say, however, the NHS rollout does involve, good wraparound services to help people change what they're doing, which is quite different to what we see in other countries. We look to the US where, rollout of these drugs is further along. And so there is recognition that you can't just give people these drugs and that be the only touch point. So, over a 2-year program of taking these drugs within the NHS, you have at least 21 medical appointments with a wide range of different professionals to support people as they take them and help give them the best chance possible to change their dietary patterns.
Do we know whether within that there's any sort of discussion on sustainability of the foods that they're eating as well? I'm guessing probably.
I haven't heard any discussion of that other than around helping people eat towards a more a more healthy diet, which is typically better from a sustainability perspective. More fresh fruit and vegetables, more fiber, less packaged, food. So typically a healthier diet is better from an environmental perspective. I think the key question there is around protein and what sort of protein people get, and where they get it from. Is it animal protein? Is it plant-based protein? And how do they think about
that? Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing because this is already new, we don't yet know how those wraparound services are working out yet, and whether they're changing people's diets longer term.
I haven't seen good data yet that's been published in terms of how those are really working to change people's behavior, either if they continue taking drugs for a long period of time or if they discontinue taking the drugs. But there are a wide range of services that are offered for people taking these, and they can be quite effective in helping people change their diet. So I think there is good hope for those, and if they are structured in such a way that really gets people to a healthier and there's an opportunity for that to be a more sustainable diet, then it could be beneficial. Yeah.
Okay. So question from Harriet Bell, who's hi Harriet, nice to see you. Harriet is head of regenerative farming, I believe, at Riverford, and she's asking a question which is just related to what we're talking about. She says, presumably, if the majority of these drugs are being prescribed privately, those consumers may not be getting the same level of support with healthy diet choices that the NHS consumers are getting.
Yes, exactly. So some of the private prescribers are offering really good comprehensive wraparound services, and I think you might see individuals for whom they have long wanted to change their weight and their associated health impact of that, and want to make a whole lifestyle change from it, and sort of see this as a bit of a personal fire break for them. But you also see many people who are just getting these through online pharmacies. They'll jump around between different pharmacies based on which is cheapest each month, and therefore they're not sort of through a continued journey of care.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, I mean, the government hasn't tried particularly hard to do anything else yet to tackle obesity. We were just talking before we started the webinar, weren't we, about examples in other countries of what's been going on. I wonder if it's worth just talking about some examples that of, Victoria, that are either not using these sorts of drugs, or that are using them in a really strategic way, like you say, in a sort of fire break kind of way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't think I've seen any good examples where they're being used to drive more systematic change in the food system yet, but we might in the coming years. And I think that's just a case that they have only been used from a weight management perspective and an obesity perspective for only a couple of years now. And they have actually had a relatively restricted amount of supply for that short period, because there has been such rapid uptake of them. So in terms of other sort of more holistic government interventions, there's a wide range of different things that different governments have done in different places. Where they have been more effective, it is around really building some of the cultural change and the mindset change. So as Jen mentioned before this call, we were talking about Japan and some of the cultural shifts that the Japanese government put in place to really help reshape access to healthy food, to reshape knowledge and understanding of that, anchoring that around schools with nutrition education. The food that's given in the schools is very healthy, is very aligned with the national food culture, and it is part of the conversation. So it is a chance for children to learn about the food that they're eating, where it comes from, what it means, what it does for them, and really think about the whole sort of food system, but in a way that makes it very real and tangible. So Japan has been relatively effective in terms of managing obesity and kind of building a strong food culture around what's healthy. And I think we can also look to other countries, be that some of the Scandinavian countries, or be that some of the other European countries, where there's a similarly strong food culture, and that is supported by different government policy, whether that's in school and education, and reinforcing that from an early age, or through agriculture and the production side of things.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Could you take your slides down? We can see you a bit better. There we are. Thank you. So we've got lots of questions coming in, which is really good. Some of them I think are probably asking for a bit of clarity because some of it is stuff you've already covered. So maybe you can add a little bit to. There's a question here from someone called Alex Johnstone. I'm interested in how the drugs influence diet quality, both short term and longer term. I don't know if you're able to elaborate at all, Victoria, on what you've said about that.
So I think in terms of the quality of what people eat, a lot of what we see is relatively anecdotal. So I will use that disclaimer. It's typically survey data, which is not always the most accurate in terms of what people say they've done. But there are multiple surveys which show people do eat significantly less unhealthy food, be that snacks, be that food that's high in fat, salt, or sugar, salty snacks, sweet snacks, desserts, soft drinks, alcohol, etc. So from a dietary perspective, I think there's relatively consistent themes around what people eat less of. There's not consistent themes around people eating an absolute amount more of different things, but I think we can point to some good examples where people eat more things like fresh fruit and vegetables, more more fresh produce, and also the message is landing with individuals who are taking these drugs that they need to be thoughtful about their protein intake and their fiber intake to help support kind of muscle development where they're rapidly losing weight, and support their digestion with fiber. And I think there needs to be a little bit more focus around the nutrient density of what people eat to ensure they're getting the right micronutrients from a broad range of kind of largely fresh fruit and vegetables. There is also some anecdotal evidence, though, that people are not massively shifting what they eat, but they're just eating a bit less. And I think there is some kind of widespread discourse around people who are taking these drugs that just is, the drugs will take care of it. I don't really need to think about it. I don't really need to engage in this. So I wouldn't say that it is, wholly fantastic from a dietary perspective for everybody taking these. And I do think that's where, whether it's wraparound services, whether it's education and support in a lighter touch way, it is important for people to make sure they are getting the right information around what they should eat to make sure that they are shifting their diet to something that is healthier. A big part of that, I think, will depend on the sort of diet that an individual ate before they took these drugs. There's obviously a very broad spectrum of how healthy or not that might have been.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one, actually. What is that baseline before people started? There's a question related to this from Gareth Morgan at Soil Association. He says, I've heard that on withdrawal, people quickly put on weight and in practice find life harder because their basic relationship and understanding of food has altered. If these drugs are similar to statins, which seem to be safe to use until death, that's fine. But what if something emerges that means people have to come off these drugs at some point? It's a good point. It's sort of around relationships with food, I suppose. And
yes, I think it's a really interesting one. So from my understanding is these drugs are intended to be used indefinitely and long term, and that is how a patient who has diabetes will be taking them. And because they do not alter your biology fundamentally, when you come off them, you are back to normal per se. So I think it is a very tricky one for people who discontinue the drugs and what happens. There's multiple studies that do show, as we looked at, people put the weight back on, or most people put most of the weight back on. So some lifestyle and behavior changes can keep the weight off for individuals. But there are lots of anecdotal examples around how people's food cravings might return, or they may go back to what they were eating before. And that's where I think some of these services, while people are taking the drugs, are important, and also reshaping how people choose what they eat, learn how they feel. the drugs do override that feeling of appetite and that feeling of hunger. So, it's not a permanent solution unless people make a very active way of changing what they're eating.
So I think there's quite a lot of questions around, I suppose, food companies and reformulation of products, or what kind of products are available as a result of this. There's a few questions here around that. Let me just try and pull some of them out. Liza or Liz, I'm interested in how the food industry might shift towards servicing the diets of people on these drugs. For instance, Huel, which, if anyone doesn't know, is a sort of pulse or bean pea based protein kind of drink. For instance, Huel is already offering meal replacement bars and shakes to support, she's putting in quotation marks, support people taking the drugs, which are high in protein. So that's an interesting example. They've already sort of zoned in on that sort of messaging around protein. I think other people have been asking things around just how you think the food industry, food companies might shift what they're doing in response to this.
Yeah, and it's an area that I think is really interesting. We're already seeing data that suggests some of the bigger snack companies are seeing significant volume shifts. Now, it's hard to disaggregate whether it's all related to these drugs or other things, but I think certainly in the US, there's widespread enough adoption that some of those food companies are seeing a drop in volume. So in terms of the opportunities to innovate and to change what's offered, there's some really interesting areas. From a food perspective, I think we will see more functional and fortified food, whether that's the highly functional food like a Huel type example, or other foods that are really signaling those functional benefits. I think we'll see more smaller formats. So portion size is really important. I think we might see a bit more what we kind of think of as permissible indulgence. So people who are taking these drugs do still want to have a sweet thing after supper, or do still want a snack, but they'll be much smaller. They'll be targeted with the right functional benefits. So there's a lot that could change around there. I think we'll see potentially more sort of ready meals or meal kits or different food, sort of complete meal provision targeted maybe explicitly, maybe not explicitly at people who are taking these drugs, but with the right signals. Protein's obviously a huge message, much more broadly than just individuals taking this drug at the moment, but it's a signal that really lands with people who are taking these drugs. They've heard the message they need to eat more protein, or they need to be thoughtful about their protein intake. And so those different foods that signal that, I think we'll see more of. And then, that we talked about some of the services. I think we might see more of those private sector services as people take these drugs through the private sector, where they may not get the full wraparound services, but recognize actually over time they do want to or need to shift their dietary habits. And so I think we might see a bit more private sector service for that, and or really kind of prescription oriented or personalized meal solutions for people who are taking these. There's lots of examples of people who sort of say they lose the joy of eating and it becomes quite a functional experience. And so I think we could see food that becomes quite functional for people taking these drugs. But interestingly, that's also a reason why a lot of people report discontinuing the drugs, where they didn't necessarily experience major side effects, but actually food is such a joyful social thing that becomes not very fun after a while if you're not really interested to sit down to dinner with your family or with friends. People might get to their health goal or some of the way to their health goal, but actually think this isn't worth the kind of way that it's changed my relationship with food.
That's a really interesting one. I think that's maybe not talked about much, is the cultural impact of this, because really if we're talking about proper shift, like real lasting sort of shift in food and diet, then it has to have like this massive cultural element to it, doesn't it? So if it just becomes this joyless functional thing, then that's sort of, well, quite problematic.
It becomes very much about fuel. And I think from a broader
Yeah.
food system change, what we actually want is for people to engage much more heavily with the food that they eat, to be much more thoughtful about what they're eating, what it's doing for them from a health perspective, where it's coming from, how it's grown, how does it get there, the seasonality, all of those different elements. I think we need people to engage more with the food that we're eating. Perhaps this will provide a way to do that, but I don't see that to be an inevitability.
Neil's got his hand up.
Yeah, it's just while we're sort of touching on the topic of trends in the US and what, you know, they're further along the curve than us. And I heard somewhere, I can't remember where, it's probably just hearsay, but that when it came to very large corporations employing lots of people, because obesity and diet-related ill health problems are affecting the economy and are affecting corporate performance sometimes, that insurance companies were encouraging large corporations to pay for staff to move on to these drugs. And so that's just something, I can't remember where I picked it up, but I heard it. And I just wondered whether you've got evidence of that sort of thing,
yes,
either in the US or being picked up in the UK following on.
So in the US, that is absolutely true. And it's obviously a little bit different because of the way the insurance system in the US works. But I think in the last year, it has over the number of companies covering these drugs through their insurance policy has over doubled because of exactly that. The companies start to see the economic and the productivity benefits of it. From an insurer perspective, there's some interesting dynamics because actually, if it does reduce the overall health costs for an individual, that's not necessarily in the insurance company's interest long term. So there's some quite complicated, dynamics in the US. From a UK perspective, I haven't seen that yet in a widespread basis in the UK where employers are covering the prescription costs of this. One thing perhaps that's worth calling out is that the cost of these drugs is significantly different in the US than in the UK, a little bit because of how the insurance market works there. But if you're paying out of pocket in the US, it can be sort of $800 or $1,000 a month, whereas it's about 150 to 250 pounds a month here, which is, very different level of affordability privately between here and the US. And I think part of why we've seen more interest from a private prescription uptake for people here.
I think Donald Trump had a friend he mentioned a few weeks ago, didn't he? A very, very nice guy or something. I can't remember what he said about him, but it was really funny. Who noticed the difference in the prices.
Okay.
That is extraordinary price difference, isn't it? My God. If we're talking about money, then there's a kind of a question here around lobbying and whether you're seeing or or you expect there to be, I suppose, lobbying from food manufacturers who are potentially likely to lose out from this. And any thoughts on that? Because I imagine there's also a lot of lobbying that it's probably happening on encouraging the use of these drugs as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an area that I see or know well, so I haven't. I'm not sure I could comment on that, but I think it is certainly an area that the food manufacturers, particularly those who are exposed to the US market, are concerned about and are watching closely, because a small drop in volume has quite a big impact on their business and on their profitability. So it's certainly an area they're all watching. And what they'll need to do to evolve the portfolio of the food they sell. How do they make sure that the food is still remains relevant for people, and an area that I think for some of those companies will be very, very challenging to change what they do.
Yeah. Moving on to land use change, there's a question here. It says, has there been any modelling data to look at predictions in land use change over time based on drug usage? If not, I guess, do you think that's an area, like a good area for research, Victoria?
I think it could be really interesting. I haven't seen extensive data on it. I think what's What's complicated about it is the global nature of the food supply chains. And so even if in a hypothetical world we saw very large and widespread usage in this country, because so much of our food comes from global markets, whether that's whole food or whether that's ingredients into more manufactured food, to really shift the global markets around what those commodities are would require, I think, wider sustained usage than just the UK. But I think it could be a really interesting area. And one of the debates we've been discussing as a team is actually what could this mean for regenerative agriculture, and are there ways that we can reduce the intensity of some of our agriculture, where actually a relatively small drop in demand for food could really shift what's required, without those things being more expensive, because we have a little bit more land available.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, you've obviously been looking into this, for quite a while. In the conversations that you have with people, is this something that's coming up much? That kind of that end of the chain, this sort of discussion around land use change, is that something that feels like it's being talked about much? I don't think
it's an area that's being talked about at all at the moment, partly because there's still quite a lot of uncertainty as to what will that adoption curve look like, how fast will it go, how high will it go, what will we learn about these drugs. And there's some significant swing factors, as you mentioned. Perhaps we'll see a major side effect that means that actually the rollout of these is much more moderated. Perhaps we will see that actually there's a way of these drugs targeting some of the chronic conditions which are not necessarily related to diet-related ill health, and there could be even more widespread use of them. So I think there's a very broad fan of outcomes at the moment, which will make it very hard to foresee. But I think it's an area that could be really interesting, and we're not hearing much discussion of how this might change what people eat, and therefore the sustainability of the food that is produced, and the affordability of the food that is produced. What does that mean, through the full value chain of food, from the farmer through to what people pay when they go to their supermarket or wherever they get their food.
Yeah, so a good area to look into for anyone on the call who maybe can look into that. Another question from Catriona. She says, I wonder if those who are paying up to £300 a month on private prescription would be more motivated to eat healthier, and I suppose therefore get off the drugs, as there is a financial commitment, compared to people who are getting the drugs for free on the NHS. Is there going to, I don't know if there's any research on that sort of motivation to be able to come off the drugs.
It's an interesting question, the idea of, do you value something more because you pay for it, which I think opens up very big questions about how we value healthcare in this country.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any data that would be looking at what's the sustained weight loss for individuals who've taken the drugs with NHS support or who've paid privately. I think it would be hard to look at from a data perspective, because the NHS access has to date been restricted to those who most need it, so who have either a high BMI, typically over 40, and or who have multiple diet-related diseases, hypertension and cardiovascular and other things. And so it is trying to be targeted at the individuals who need it the most, given the potential cost of the rollout, and the caution with which the NHS is moving.
Do we know then when someone is prescribed them on the NHS, are they that plan of organizations and individuals around them, is the aim to be able to get them off the drug eventually, or is it being seen as potentially a long-term, lifelong thing at this point?
I think so I don't have a definitive answer to that, and there is slightly different guidance from the NHS depending on which drug you're taking.
Okay.
But some of them do have a 2-year time restriction. And so the intent of that would have to be that people are supported through that 2-year period to lose weight, to address some of the associated diet-related ill health, and then to go on without taking the drugs. I think it's an area that we will start to see some of the data in the next sort of 12 to 24 months as people come to the end of that 2-year period. So it does vary a little bit. And I think from an NHS cost perspective, it would be unaffordable to fund these drugs at the current price point indefinitely for a large proportion of the population. It would swallow the whole NHS budget.
Yes.
And so in order for that to be the case, where people are taking the drugs for life, like a statin, it would need to come down to the price point of a statin, such that people could take them for a sustained period of time.
Yeah. There are quite a lot of questions around meat and protein, so I wonder if we can explore that a little bit more. Someone here, Kat, is saying, she said, sorry if I missed it, but is there data specifically on meat consumption when taking these? So I think there's a question around what protein, if people are, I think you said it's not so much the total amount of protein that someone is consuming is going up, it's the proportion.
Yeah.
Because they're kind of maintaining that protein. Do we know, are people tending to maintain the same sorts of protein? Are they changing what sorts of proteins they're eating? Do we know if the NHS wraparound service is encouraging movement towards certain types of protein or plant-based proteins or anything like that?
So the data that I have seen is primarily sort of survey-based, sort of self-reported data on what people say they're eating less or more of, but relatively large-scale survey data. And it does suggest that people are eating less. They are changing a little bit the mix of the protein that they eat, and perhaps eating a little bit less red meat. And because it's richer, it's perhaps a little bit harder to digest, and eating a little bit more things like dairy. So there is an indication of potentially a bit of a switch. I haven't seen, for example, that people are eating less red meat and more pulses and legumes and sort of pure plant-based proteins. It's an area that could be looked at, because people also do need to increase their fiber consumption while they're taking these drugs. So that's kind of the best I've seen around the protein switch. But what we have seen relatively consistent data that people are not significantly increasing the amount of protein that they eat at a total level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So
just an area to continue watching.
Yeah.
There are more people taking these drugs, and as the wider discourse around protein, evolves as well. A lot of people are increasing their animal protein intake. Also, a lot of people are just picking up any bar on the supermarket shelf that has protein splashed across it, and that's coming from a wide variety of different things. So I think it is going to be an area to continue watching as to how much do people really shift their intake.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of mixed messaging around protein, of what's healthy, what's desirable, what's sustainable. Another question here around is there a risk that the blanket messaging on protein amplifies existing cultural desirability, advertising and demand, to the extent that, for example, Climate Change Committee recommendations on ruminant meat production and consumption goals aren't met? Quite a big question there. But
I think that's probably another whole webinar if I look at this 2 minutes.
I think so. It's like a PhD. Great question though, whoever said that.
I think there's a very big question there in terms of overall protein consumption and focus on protein at the moment, where that's coming from, how people are getting it, how thoughtful about what sorts of protein that is. We already eat more than enough protein. Fiber is the big thing we do not eat enough of as a population, and so we don't in general need to eat more protein. We need to change protein. And
yeah, thank you. Neil, do you have any last questions or comments before I'm just noticing the time?
No, only to say I thought that was great, Victoria. Really, really authoritative, and a fascinating development, which raises big questions, I think, for thinking about the food system, behaviour, and sustainability, and the junk food cycle, and whether it helps deal with some of those structural issues. It looks more like a sort of sticking plaster to me, but absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. I really like your framing around seeing it as a fire break rather than a panacea. I think that's really critical. So thank you for coming with that kind of framing and posing that to us. Thank you everyone for all your questions as well. We've had loads, which is really good. I can see the chat is really active too. But yeah, just to say thank you, Victoria, all your insights. Sounds like it's going to be rumbling on for a while, so we'll look out for anything else that you're doing on this. Please keep in touch and let us know what you're working on. We've been recording this, obviously, so if anyone wants to watch this back, we'll be putting the video online in a few days, and we'll email you all about it. Please take 3 minutes to rate this webinar. Neil, if you're able to, if you're not already done, put the link to the webinar survey in the chat again, that'd be great. AFN funding is due to end in December, so we're collecting just lots of information to help us kind of make the case for continuing in some way. So if you could do that, that'd be great. We're going to have a break now on webinars for August, so we'll be back in September on our monthly webinar series. So please look out for an invite in your mailboxes. Sign up if you haven't already. But yeah, just to say thanks again, Victoria, and we'll keep talking. Thank you.
Thank you.